the Ricochet effect. Ricochet effect, like Ricochet effect. Yeah. We having conversation with no moderation. Love to the communities, the Ricochet effect. Having conversation with no moderation. Love to the communities, the Ricochet effect. Having conversation with no moderation.
Hi, this is Renee Cobb, and
I'm Dr. Abini El-Amin, and we are with the Ricochet Effect.
Yeah.
we're broadcasting from WUKY, and I am so pleased that we have several guests today, Dr. El-Amin, and these guests today will speak to the topic of accessibility in regards to people of vision and hearing loss. And we have first Jeremy Smith. He is also a member of our WUKY DEIB CAB from Lexington, Kentucky. We'll talk a little bit more about what that alphabet soup is like. And we also have Marcey Ansley from the Hearing and Speech Center in Lexington, Kentucky. First of all, Jeremy and Marcey, welcome to the Ricochet Effect.
Hi.
Yes,
Hey,
welcome.
Thanks for having us.
First of all, with the two of you, can we talk first around some terminology that's appropriate and correct when addressing people who have lost their sight or have lost their hearing to some ability? And Jeremy, can we start with you?
Sure, go ahead.
What is some appropriate terminology that we utilize or that we should speak to when we are addressing or talking about the topic of loss of vision?
Yeah. Well, and I'll say first, like I'm not a scholar on this issue, and anything that I might say about vision loss is probably anecdotal. It's my experience, or professionally, I do work with other visually impaired people, so it may be their experience that I share too. Visually impaired is normally the term I use. I think sometimes when you're really trying to get somebody's attention, I might say legally blind, because blind seems to be a word that people, well, it's a mixed bag, right? Because when you use the word blind, I think people hear that in very black or white terms. And so if you say, I'm legally blind, they assume that you can't see anything. But sometimes that's what you need from somebody, right? To appreciate the situation and what's going on for you as the visually impaired person. But yeah, in most cases, visually impaired would be the term I would use to describe my personal circumstances.
Well, thank you for that. And Marcey, talk to us about what is considered appropriate when addressing people with hearing loss.
Sure. So we are always, from a professional standpoint, we do people first and just talk about persons with hearing loss. And everybody is very much, I think, listening to you talk about the difference between blindness and visual impairment, the same in the community of hearing loss, because there are people who identify as deaf and people who identify as deafblind, people who identify as hard of hearing. And so a lot of it has to do with personal preference and level of hearing loss. So one person who has profound hearing loss may identify themselves as a deaf person, where somebody else with the same level may identify themselves as hard of hearing. So we usually try to keep it simplified and just say persons with hearing loss, and let each individual identify how they want to be kind of categorized in the various communities in the world of hearing loss.
And Marcey, you are from the Hearing and Speech Center. So are there similar mindsets around loss of speech or difficulty with speech?
Very similar. So we talk about persons with speech delay or speech disorder, speech disability. So it really depends, because is it something that either a child, we work predominantly with pediatric clients at the moment, but is it a disability disorder or a diagnosis that we'll be able to completely treat, or is it something that we're going to be mitigating for the rest of their life? So someone, for example, with a fluency disorder or a stutter is most likely going to be dealing with strategies their entire lifespan. So they may say that they have a speech impediment or a speech issue. I've heard a lot of our older kids and young adults talk about the fact that they've got a speech impediment or a speech issue.
Excellent.
Right. And so I know you had talked about the DEIB CAB, and so I did want to break that down for our listeners. And so DEIB stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And then the CAB stands for our Community Advisory Board. And so we have our WUKY DEIB CAB, and it's certainly been an amazing experience and journey. And Jeremy, and as well as Renee and I, sit on the board. And this whole concept of accessibility is important when we think about the alphabet soup of DEIB. A, right? And so the A is the accessibility aspect. And we think it's important that we take this thread and that we weave everything together, because that is important for people to understand. And even though I've been doing this work for over 30 years, can you believe it? I hear people all the time, they say, what does D and I stand for? Mm-hmm. And in my world, I think that it's just a normal term that everyone knows about. But quite frankly, that's not always the case, is it?
No, it's not. And Dr. Elamine, I've heard you say that if we take the D out of that alphabet soup and we talk about that represents diversity, that she has said in many of her speeches, and I just love this, she says diversity is the DNA of DEIB. Mm-hmm. So before we talk about accessibility, let's talk about diversity, because that ties really closely to accessibility. And as I watched her speak at a conference recently, I became aware of how she defines diversity. And honestly, I thought it was the best definition that I've ever seen or heard. So,
well, thank you very much.
So Dr. Elamine, how do you define diversity? And then we'll talk about how that kind of threads the needle through the accessibility.
Absolutely. So when I think of diversity, I think of our humanity and our shared humanity. In many cases in society, we talk about the negative aspects, or we talk about the gaps, and as opposed to focusing on our strengths. And although we share so much together, that should not take away from our individuality. So I define diversity as a term that refers to an inclusive community with varied characteristics, ideas, perspectives, and worldviews, and whose interactions both benefit and challenge each other to grow in an ever-changing society.
So that's just outstanding, wouldn't you all agree?
That's amazing.
But when you look at, okay, we have diversity, we have equity, we have inclusion, and we have belonging. And a lot of organizations do have the A also in there as well with accessibility. So as we talk about accessibility, we should note that this month of October has marked two significant awareness events with World Sight Day and also Audiology Awareness Month. So first, Marcey, let's talk about Audiology Awareness Month. What is it, and why do we need to be aware of it?
That's a great question. So Audiology Awareness Month came out through a couple of different of our national organizations to really promote the importance of hearing healthcare and the fact that everyone needs to understand that our ears are really the pathway to our brains and all kinds of other body systems. And we take our ears for granted and we don't treat them well. So having an entire month to talk about noise-induced hearing loss and making hearing healthcare part of your healthcare journey is really important, because our audiologists are trained doctors in ear healthcare. So they're helping not only with evaluation of potential diagnosis for hearing loss or vestibular issues, they're also treating with hearing devices such as hearing aids, cochlear implants, bone-anchored hearing aids from for our case, we call it Twinkle to Wrinkle, but so we do babies through seniors. And then really helping clients understand how to protect their ears. So if we get folks in young enough and we're seeing some baseline issues, how to continue to reduce that noise-induced hearing loss and protect our hearing for as long as possible, because it doesn't have to be an issue that we're facing in our senior adulthood if we're kinder to our ears at a younger age. So we really are grateful that we have an entire month to talk about how our ears really are part of our entire healthcare system, and it often gets neglected.
And we've had an opportunity to work together through bringing awareness to hearing loss with musicians here in Lexington, and how they are not often aware of what the impact of being on a stage in a loud room does to their ears over time. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But Jeremy, let's talk about World Sight Day. And first of all, let me ask you, were you aware that there is a World Sight Day? And what other days should we be aware of?
Yeah, I've seen some of these celebrations, but it's not something I keep my finger on the pulse of these kinds of things. So, but it's just the topic of accessibility. And again, like maybe this is my cynical point of view, but I don't know that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, I feel like disability is often, it's not the sexiest part of that conversation, right? And I'm a therapist, so my explanation for so many things comes back to human psychology, and I think people see people living with different circumstances and challenges. It's really scary for people to see people living with disability. And so most of the time people shy away from that conversation. It's our nature to run from what's scary, right? It's the Halloween season. So, but so I think there's an uphill battle to get people to want to have conversations about disability, and that makes the accessibility component that much more challenging, because it's just not a topic most people want to delve into. I think it makes people think about their own mortality and the fact that none of us are going to be here forever. So
that's a really good point. And so in a lot of the work that I do, it's in organizational development, and that then requires me to investigate inclusion and bringing people into organizations or making people feel included. How do we do that for both individuals who have less accessibility or less ideology or vision?
Well, I would say the most fundamental thing we can do when you see someone else who might be struggling or have a challenge or something of that nature is it's okay to ask a question. Obviously you want to frame the question in a certain way if possible, but for me personally, I would much rather, like 1,000 times, I would rather somebody come to me and ask me what's going on, or if they can be a support to me in some way. And, people fumble these questions. I've done the same thing when asking a question like this to somebody who I don't necessarily know. But even a question that is maybe not the most delicate in how it's asked, I would prefer that as to when you're visually impaired, for some reason, people think that you cannot perceive them staring at you. That is absolutely false. You can tell when the air in the room changes, right? We have senses beyond just what we can see, which is another thing I think people take for granted. But so for instance, I went to a movie recently with a buddy. It was a documentary, a music documentary. And as we're walking in, I'm using my white cane. I've got his elbow. He's functioning as a sighted guide. That's what that's called when somebody leads me through a space. They are a sighted guide. And there's a cluster of people standing to my left. And I guess they think that I don't know they're there. But I know their jaws are just on the ground, like gawking at me right now. Like, that's just...
You can feel the energy.
Yes. And I think at the most fundamental level, if we're going to include people, if we want to be part of a world where everybody is welcome and everybody is equal, don't do that. Just don't do that. Just say hi.
Yes.
I'll say hi back. And then there's some ice is broken there. It's just that simple. But again, there's a shock value to... And I think this is another, and sorry, Marcy, I'm not going
no,
to
you're
monopolize
fine.
this.
We're all listening and wonder.
These are great conversations.
I think there's a certain amount of shock value to seeing people functioning, doing normal daily things like going to the movies, because it's hard for people with disabilities to do very normal things often. And so you get that, and it's you see it a lot out of kids, right? Like a mom's in the grocery store and she's got her 4-year-old with her, and somebody comes by and they're using a wheelchair or something. So the kid asks about that, a very loud vocal question.
Which I think is fair. They're trying to
love
understand
it.
the world, as we all are.
Absolutely. So please answer that question in an honest way that doesn't deflect, from the reality of the situation. But, the same happens with adults. They just don't process that in as honest and vocal a way. And, that doesn't help things. Like hiding from what I know to be real. This is my daily reality. You don't need to pretend like this is not the case or something on my behalf. So anyway, a wandering, meandering answer to the question there.
I'll tell you, I was so happy that you applied to be on our WUKY DEIB CAB.
Yes.
Because the Daredevil is one of my favorite superheroes.
Oh, yeah.
And
that's
it's
great.
because of the fact that he doesn't have at least one sense that is his primary or at all, right? But that's why he's so good at so many other things. So what's your superpower?
Oh, wow. That is a good question.
I have my theories.
Well, I think it's so professionally. I'm a therapist. I'm a counselor. I run my own small private practice. I'm also a writer, so I've written a memoir about my own experiences, and that's largely about losing my eyesight slowly. I have a degenerative retinal disease, so from the time I was 10 years old, I've been losing my eyesight. There's no way to predict your future, when you're 10 and you're just told like, oh yeah, your eyes are going to get bad. And there's no clear indication of like, well, how long does that take and how bad is bad, So that's the memoir is about that. But I've also started writing fiction, and I've got a novel that's pretty much done at this point. So all that stuff, it's about empathy. And I think I was always meant to do the things that I do with my life right now, which are writing, music, and my practice, because all those things are about, even the stories that I tell in my songs, it's all about the human experience and how challenging and complicated and difficult that often is. But there's a lot of love and magic and beautiful things to be found in the world, even when the world is a very blurry place like it is for me now. So I think that's my superpowers, empathy and wanting to live in and tell those very human stories.
Yeah, I think if we can be honest with ourselves, regardless if we're sighted or if we have any issues with audiology, or audio, I don't know, the hearing.
Yeah.
Yes, let's keep it simple.
Mm-hmm.
Is that at times life is blurry for all of us. I was talking to a forum a couple of weeks ago, and I said that at some point all of us are going to go through the aging process if we're blessed enough to live long enough, right? So at some point we're all going to experience something similar.
Yes, and so Marcy, let's hear that same question from your perspective as well.
Really, when I think about the inclusion piece in particular around hearing loss, because often I'm going to think about or look at this in a couple of different ways, because with our pediatric clients, it's a very different conversation because they are growing up with hearing loss, and I can go into my personal journey there in a moment. But with our adults in particular, they will shy away and act like they know what's going on when they don't. And so I think really being mindful around meetings or the dinner table or at a coffee shop, and just making sure that we're asking the right questions and looking at people the correct way. So if they are lip reading, that they have what they need to be part of the experience and the environment is really important. And our kids do this much better than our adults. So, kids in general, and Renee knows my story, but my son, Alex, is 22. He'll be 23 in December, and he was born with bilateral sensory neural hearing loss. So he has a moderate to severe hearing loss. And it's interesting, as he's gotten older, depending on the scenario he's in, he will say that he's deaf. And although he uses no sign language yet, but he really feels like I think similar to what your conversation earlier about blindness, that he's like, I feel like the impact is there when I say the word deaf as opposed to hard of hearing. Mm-hmm. And in order to get people to include me in conversation and dialogue, and that you don't have to scream at me, but if we can have a conversation as long as I can see you, and being able to be that advocate. And I think our kids are just a lot better at advocating for what they need because they've grown up with it. And so Alex, is a 22-year-old, is a much better advocate for himself around any table at their university setting, or he's at a board meeting today. And so to get what he needs to be included in the conversation. And what really I think is important from a society standpoint is that we don't do enough closed captioning on anything. Every event I go to, with the exception of our own, there are no live captioners. And so for people who can't hear, a large conference, convention, meeting, event, concert, whatever it is, there's very little accessibility for our persons with hearing loss to understand what's happening in the totality of our world. And so there's a lot of advocacy happening on a national level to have movie theaters have captioning. And, we just saw, which is a really neat story, the football player from Gallaudet now has a screen, the quarterback, inside his helmet, so his coach can sign to him and he can see it in his helmet. So I'm like all of these great strategies in order to make people part of the conversation from an accessibility and inclusivity standpoint.
And Marcey, I've heard you say, I know Dr. Elamine would have an appreciation for this too, that when it comes to the point, or if it comes to the point where you need hearing aids, that those are going to be all sparkly and blingy.
They are. I keep talking to the hearing aid manufacturers. I'm like, we need some fun hearing aids for the grown-ups.
With sparkles.
With sparkles. And you can get all kinds of fun ear molds now. They're great. They have glitter, and even if they don't, because I want hot pink ones when we get there. I already know what I want. So, but it's hilarious. Yeah. And again, the kids they have so much fun with their hearing devices.
It's so much better than when I was a child and I had to go through the process of wearing the patch over one of the eyeglasses,
right.
like it's being a young child. And I will never forget how humiliating and things that felt, because it just really made you feel different, and the environment was not really well educated on how to train kids on how to act. I think it's so much better now, and now you see when they have to wear the patch over like one eye for astigmatism, or a lazy eye is what they called it. That's also got some kind of like negative connotation, right? You have a lazy eye.
Yes.
But it's so much better now, I think, than it used to be, but we still have a long way to go.
We do.
And as Jeremy described the process of having someone next to him that he could intuitively feel, right? I will say that I'm also a person of hearing loss, and I am totally deaf in some situations, just like your son said. If I'm in a loud, crowded room, I can hear absolutely nothing. But I don't have that ability. This is what I think is kind of interesting, is that I don't have that ability to sense when somebody's beside me talking. So that's just really kind of interesting, with the loss of sight and the loss of hearing. So I have to physically see someone if they are talking to me for it to make any type of sense at all. So I typically get the, I'm talking to you, can't you hear me? I'm right beside you. And then I have to go into the routine about, why I can't hear you. And then I have two responses. One of them is either, oh, what happened? And then the other one is, I'll talk louder so you can hear me. And I've just explained I'm profoundly deaf. So you're talking, that's another misconception, isn't it?
Exactly, 100%.
And do people,
100%.
Jeremy, do people talk louder around you whenever they find out that you can't see?
They do, and I usually throw something at them.
That's fair. Well, and it is interesting. So when you talk about this concept of inclusion, so when one is guiding you, I even find myself, Jeremy, that when I am doing so, that I have to slow down. And anybody who knows me knows I run at the speed of light. So it's on the other side of it, it's being empathetic enough and in the moment enough to mentally, emotionally slow down so that you can serve or to help another person.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love, can I
Yes,
just a quick
please.
story. It just popped into my head. Part of the Hearing and Speech Center, we've started as the deaf oral school for preschoolers, and 63 years later, we have an inclusive early learning center as one of our programs. And I love it when our kids who are developing on a typical track will make hearing aids or cochlear implants and like tape them to their head, because for them that's part of playing with their friends, and they get really sad when they don't get to go to speech therapy, and they get very sad when they don't get to go to the booth for testing. So we're normalizing at such a young age differences in diversity with our little kids, because we're 0 through 6 or 7. And one of our moms who has 2 boys that needed no services came back to me, and they're now in high school. And she's like, my boys became the anti-bully. They were the ones to stand up for children with all kinds of abilities in their school. And she's like, it's because they started at a place like this for early education. And those were, I mean, as a mama with a kiddo with hearing loss, I mean, we're a unicorn place for what we do. And I knew we needed to be there from the time he was born. But for the families that don't need all of the programming, it really didn't hit me until I started working there, the importance of what we're teaching our little kids and how we're making it, if we can start there in order to have a better world.
Absolutely.
It's just amazing to me.
I also think that educationally we're doing a much better job of including people at different stages of their lives and with different scenarios in educational materials. And so I mean, I
Absolutely.
think that's important to normalize that there is no such thing as a perfect person.
Absolutely. We have The Giraffes Can Dance. I don't know if you know that book, and it's wonderful because it talks about, all of the different animals in the forest and how everyone dances a little bit differently. And they said giraffes can't dance because they have long necks. And Jeffrey the giraffe gets out and he dances beautifully. So
We all find our own way.
we all
right?
find our way.
So much like the fact in our generation, we grew up without any or some really bad form of sunscreen, right, to protect our skin. I feel that that's probably happened with a mindset around protecting our ears and our eyes as well. So what do you think has been done in the last, maybe even 2 decades around educating awareness around protecting your ears and also protecting your eyes? So Jeremy, let me start with you.
Well, what I can say from talking with a lot of clients in the last few years who have visual impairment, what I would just say is that's something to stay on top of. I've got at least a couple of clients I can think of off the top of my head who were told they needed to keep up with regular appointments because if they didn't, something might happen, and if you don't catch it in a timely manner, it becomes that much more problematic. And so, I can think of a couple of people who are dealing with pretty serious sight loss now because, and this is no judgment on them. Life comes up sometimes, right? And things can get off track, but not keeping up with some of those regular appointments when you're asked to do so. I mean, I guess they're asking for a reason, right? So whether it's glaucoma or something like that, where an accumulated effect can be increasingly problematic. It is, I have clients currently who are dealing with more sight loss than they would have been probably if things had been addressed earlier than they were.
And Marcey?
So for hearing loss, we really have not treated our ears well. While technology is helping when it comes to our smartphones, having the decibel meters on there and our smart watches telling us when we have a loud environment, there's a way to turn those off. And so we are seeing actually an increase in younger people being identified with hearing loss, with noise-induced hearing loss in particular, because once you get in there and damage those hair cells, they are not going to be repaired. It's not like a broken bone that we can reset, and it's going to be back to 100% efficiency. So any opportunity we have to reduce our noise intake is ideal. And I think there's some things that are shocking. You know, when I have 155 decibels from fireworks. Think about how many times we sit there without any ear protection, and maybe not daily, depends what you do, but mowing the grass has significant impact. And those who are hunters, musicians are really, really impacted by noise-induced hearing loss. So finding ways to protect your ears are really critical.
Question, Marcy?
Yeah.
So is it 90 dB that you should not exceed?
85.
85.
85 dB. That you don't really want to. Lengthy exposure to 85 and above is considered very impactful.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So yes. And there's a lot of custom ear molds that can be made, and a lot of our musicians have custom ear molds to help support that, because you don't want to give up your passion or your career, of course, but there are ways to help ensure some safety. And then the other thing that we talk about a lot is that baseline hearing screening, much to what you're talking about, like sending people to the doctor. But getting a baseline hearing screening, we say at 40, really it could be even younger depending on the situation. I mean, we get our everything checked now. So hearing should be part of that. And it doesn't take very long, and insurance pays for it. So there's really no excuse to not go to get your hearing tested by an audiologist anywhere.
You know, what's interesting too is people that mow the lawn and then they have music on their headphones.
They're drowning out the lawnmower with their music.
Another really interesting combination is I had a musician friend that had his decibel meter, and he was just playing acoustic guitar, actually not even singing, just playing acoustic guitar. But what he noticed is every time he started playing, the decibel level in the room went up because all of the audience was talking at their tables, and that also presents harm.
It does.
And he would stop playing, and then it would go way down. He'd start playing, and all of a sudden everybody starts talking. And that's a whole nother show, isn't it, Jeremy? People talking during music.
Oh, gosh.
But, we talked a lot about protection and proactivity, but let's talk about accessibility and what that word means to those who are sight or hearing challenged. And I know I've asked you all to kind of come up with maybe one or two, I don't want to call them nightmare stories, but things that you've experienced that other people may not really be aware of. That they do, but they're just unconsciously not aware that this may be even a microaggression.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little day in the life of situation. So if I want to go somewhere and I'm going solo somewhere, for me, given where I live, there's not a bus stop immediately right outside my door. So I say all this because I want people to appreciate how holistic accessibility is. It's not just, is there a ramp getting up to the front door of an office building? That's just a small part of the larger equation. But so if I want to go somewhere, I would generally take, you can use Lyft or Uber. That's an option for most people. A lot of single women may not necessarily want to use that, particularly visually impaired women. But that also becomes costly. If I want to go across town, it's on $25 or $30. Who wants to do that over and over again? So I would use the local paratransit service, which is called Wheels. To do that, you have to call 24 hours in advance. They give you a window of time in which they're going to arrive. So you have to kind of be prepared to just kind of waiting by the front door to be ready to jump out. And, the fact is there's a great demand on that service right now. And Lexington is actually having some conversations about adding a second service that would fill in some of the gaps there, but hopefully that happens. But so Wheels can be, it's very affordable, but it's also problematic if you're trying to do things in a timely manner. But, the upside to Wheels is they are a service where people are trained to, so I could ask the driver in that situation to guide me to the front door of wherever I'm trying to go. So then I get in the front door, and let's say I'm going to a doctor's appointment or something. If I've never been there before, I went for a routine medical thing earlier this year, and as we're moving around in the hospital, I'm thinking, am I in like a Harry Potter movie or something like this? Like, how can a space have this many turns? It's just a maze in there. So there's the challenge of just physically finding where you're supposed to go. And then there's the challenge of getting in there and filling out the paperwork. And even if the paperwork is provided ahead of time electronically, that doesn't guarantee that I'm able to fill it out. This is another big issue for visually impaired people is websites, paperwork. It's often not prepared in a way that makes it accessible using screen reading software. So there are universal principles of design that for anybody building a website and you want it to be accessible, I would encourage you to please get your web designer to follow those universal principles of design. So, it's just that complicated. It goes above and beyond where does my vision create an obstacle, because there's going to be a number of those. But the other thing, too, is just the demand on someone emotionally and in terms of your stamina for this stuff, because the amount of stress that comes with doing very routine things, it's somebody who needs a quart of milk. They hop in the car and they drive down the grocery store. They grab it. They're back home in 20 minutes. Well, not with Lexington traffic, but that for me to do something like that is just a much, much bigger issue, and it comes with a certain amount of stress. That again, it's human nature to not necessarily want to have to walk through fire every day. And so a lot of stuff gets avoided or skipped over because I just don't have it in the tank today. I don't have the gas in the tank to go do this today. It's too stressful and taxing. And so I think that's and again, I'm getting long-winded, but the last thing I would say too is the last time I saw numbers about the number of people in Lexington who have visual impairments, and these are probably dated figures at this point, but it was something like 5,000 people. So that's a lot of folks for a city this size. And it's been, we have a race for the governor's office going on right now. And one of the things that I've heard several times is this complaint about our workforce engagement numbers in this state. Apparently, Kentucky does not have a very high rate of workforce engagement. And so, I'm thinking, well, if the world were a bit more accessible and inclusive, there's a lot of visually impaired people in particular have historically a very low rate of employment. And there's a reason for that, because it's hard. And but I can tell you, like, this is and I've had personal experiences of just blatant discrimination when applying for jobs. That happened here in Lexington. It's unbelievable to me to this day that people would be this blatant about it. But so, I mean, you've got a willing workforce that just, make it possible for those people to be part of things. That's what everybody wants. We just want to be part of things. I think most people I know who have visual impairments would agree with that.
And that's my point, is that when you're working in the space of diversity and inclusion and accessibility, that if you are intentional, or if you have the will and motivation, which that's part of having cultural intelligence, and that is that you have to take the time to build these kinds of spaces out, whether it's you said the universal design.
The design principles for websites and stuff.
UDP.
Right. Yep.
So the universal design principles, I mean, that's an important aspect. I mean, there's a whole science behind building out an LMS or a website or what have you. And again, if you don't take the time, if you don't have the right people and experts to do this work, and if you're not willing to invest, then therein lies the issue. But I mean, everything from, and I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. So it's not just about the workforce helping people that need accessibility. It's about individuals in our humanity wanting to stand up and to ally and to be there for people. It's like if you see someone who is less sighted, struggling, then I think that all of us need to take on the onus of trying to assist that person in daily life so that you don't have to be challenged or stressed in your daily activities as well.
Hallelujah.
I liked your basic humanity, because you're right. Everything goes back to how can we be kind humans, and the humanity piece. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
And
What was
Marcey,
the original question? I'm sorry.
in regards to hearing loss, no, this is great conversation.
Wait a minute. I think I got so
Me too. I'm just enthralled.
You know, and I'll just say before
the
I ask
nightmare.
you, yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah. And if I could just add real quick, one example that I saw, and I actually passed this along to you,
Yeah.
and a news story is that there was someone that was watching a Broadway play, and they held their phone up. They were like in the third or fourth row, and they held their phone up, and the ushers came and started to try to escort them out of the theater because they thought they were filming the play, which was against the rules.
Right.
However, what this person was doing is because they could not hear the words, the text was popping up on the
They were
screen, and
captioning
she
it
had to hold the
themselves.
phone up so that device would work properly. So that was just a big uh-oh to me, but I know you have more.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot, again, when it comes to inclusion, that whole making sure that people with hearing loss can be involved in every scenario that they want to be. Same, if you want to go to church, how are we hearing at church if it's not captioned? Or is there a telecoil in the church that will go directly to the devices? So technology is very helpful, but if it's not there, you're still muffled and you don't have anything. And you're right. And there's a lot of great apps today that are supporting captioning. So you can do your own It's not great always, but I think there's a couple of golden nuggets out of COVID, one of which is that we've gotten a whole lot better with virtual meetings and virtual capability to do live captioning. And so when it comes to some of the nightmare stories, I flash to things like healthcare settings. So we have people, this is a friend story, who has hearing loss, and they were in the hospital. They removed the hearing aids in the hospital and then try to have a conversation with the patient, right? And so there's nothing in that hospital room that says I'm a patient with hearing loss. And so why that should be up on the whiteboard. I need my hearing aids, I need my cochlear implant, whatever it is, or I need a ASL interpreter, whatever the situation may be. The lack of basic human connection when it comes to modality is completely missing often, 9 times out of 10 from what we have seen in a healthcare setting, especially if it's an acute situation. And same thing with the police. And so there's cards now that Kentucky Commission of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing will share that will help if a person with hearing loss gets pulled over, is that they may not be able to hear or understand the police officer. So there's a card they can hand them and say, I have hearing loss, I can't hear you. We're either going to have to text back and forth, or do you have an ASL interpreter, or speak up, whatever the situation may be. Because there's all of those circumstances where if someone gets pulled over and doesn't pay attention, they could get arrested a lot quicker because they didn't hear the question. And so those are two of those kind of immediate crisis types of situations that we hear from often, in addition to, people just going, what is in your ears? But again, kids are much better about that. Go, why do you have that blue thing in your ear? And that's great when they ask, but yeah.
So Kentucky, absolutely. I mean, you've nailed it, but Kentucky has made a commitment to accessibility, and you've provided some suggestions on how to handle a stressful situation. But what are some other recommendations or other strategies or legislation that the state of Kentucky has made in hearing loss,
Sure.
or for people who have that challenge, or even visual? So start with you. We'll start with you, Marcey.
So about 20 years ago, Kentucky finally regulated the insurance paying for hearing aids, because prior to 2000, there was not a requirement for, this is pediatric only. There's no requirement for insurances to pay for adult hearing aids at the moment. And again, we're talking about a medical device to help people connect with their world through education, vocation, social, which is just, it's amazing to me. And so federal legislation around the over-the-counter hearing aids is a great first step, because they're at least recognizing the need for hearing loss. But we really need legislation to pay for the devices, pay for the treatment, because that's the only way it's going to happen. These are massive computers in your ears that are expensive. And while there are lots and lots of programs to help support getting them at a reduced or free rate, that's not going to be the case for everybody. So while our kids are almost covered in Kentucky, we still have a massive gap on who really has access to hearing health care. So that's a huge issue. We also have changed regulation in the last couple of years on access to very, very early intervention. We were part of the Kentucky Language Acquisition Project through Kentucky Commission of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Myself and a handful of other folks from my center sat on that commission or that task force, and we've backed it up into the early intervention program. So pre-2020, children identified with any level of hearing loss were not included in our early intervention program, which was called First Steps at that point. It's KEYS now. And so effective last year, that changed. So any decibel loss of either side or both, it now qualifies a child for access into that early intervention program, which gets them access to all kinds of speech language development, as well as the hearing devices themselves. So that's the good news.
Yeah, of course. What about for you, Jeremy? Are you aware of some of the programs that Kentucky has made a commitment to in regards to vision loss?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, there's probably people who are way better informed about what the state is doing and where the gaps lie. The one thing I know is that I have a number of clients who work with the Office for Vocational Rehabilitation to support their quest for employment and whatever their needs may be there. But I mean, that system seems very understaffed, and there seems to be a larger need there that they just don't have the personnel or the expertise. I'm not sure, again, where the gap is necessarily, but I know there are plenty of people who want to do more and be more involved than they are. And yeah, I certainly wish we could find a means to make that happen.
One of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast is you guys have tremendous stories, and thank you so much for the work that both of you do. But Renee has hearing loss, and she makes no qualms about it. She lets people know her story because the work that she does in diversity and inclusion, for her, it's important that people understand that while she's a Caucasian woman, that she also has accessibility challenges, and that she is part of this conversation, as we all are. We are all diverse in some way or another. But Renee, talk to us about your story in terms of hearing loss and the challenges that you've had in the music industry.
Oh, thank you so much. And also, even doing podcasting, right?
That's right. But you never know. You never know that you have any challenges because you excel at it.
And I'm sure, as you know, you have the attitudes that I do, that we can accomplish anything we set our minds to do, right? But we have to work around a lot. But after I had my son, I don't want to say it was right after I had my son, but it was probably a few months after. I had a really bad migraine headache one night, and I woke up the next morning and I couldn't hear. So, you know, being alone in the house, my husband at the time traveled, so I had this young child and I didn't have any hearing. And, you know, and I realized that when I picked up the phone, that's what was my first awareness, is that I couldn't hear the dial tone. You know, back in the old days, you had a dial tone in your ear. But went to get tested and was told that I had a profound traumatic event that was never really identified, although I did go to Cleveland Clinic and, you know, just to rule out some other things. But I was told at the time that this happens a lot, sudden hearing loss. So just learning to adapt over the years, but I will say that there's days that I don't even know that it's happening, but then there's days where I'm very much aware that it's happening. And I have to say that the pandemic was one of those times as well, because I also don't believe that, while I believe the government and everybody did the best that they could do with what was going on, that there's a lot of things that weren't missed in terms of accessibility. And one of the things is when we started, getting out of the house and getting back into public, having everybody wear a mask, and where I never realized how much I'd relied on the reading of lips to interpret messages until that happened. And then the next thing, that if I couldn't see your lips, it required that you be close in proximity to me when you're talking. That wasn't really desirable either. So, it was just really interesting how we all had to readjust and we all had to recalibrate. But, working in the music industry and being a musician growing up, and what's so fascinating is that Beethoven was deaf. You hear about all these famous composers that were afflicted, in the same way with loss of sight or loss of hearing, is that this is one of the worst things that can really happen to someone that enjoys, playing and listening to music. And I noticed that even with my hearing loss, I lost an ability to coordinate my left hand with my right hand when I was playing piano, that I've never been able to really regain. So that kind of tells me maybe it was more stroke related. But, Marcey and I have talked about this quite a bit, that it is a lot more common than what people think. But what I'd like to ask you all kind of in closing, as it relates to that, is that what does loss of hearing do to the nervous system and to the overall health? Not being able to hear, what does that do? And what kind of conditions can arise from that? And then, Jeremy, I'd like to ask you the same thing. So let's start with Marcey.
So untreated hearing loss, in particular for adults, it's one of the 11 factors for dementia. And so when we're looking at long-term kind of impact for untreated hearing loss, so we really want to be very aware, because the entrance into our ears, into our brains, help with all kinds of different centers. So for kids, it's our literacy foundation, comes through our ears. And so learning to read and everything we do in school, so educationally, vocationally, and then eventually cognitively. So it's a huge impact. And we also say that our ears are connected to, the ear bones are connected to the entire body. So we have a whole graphic. So I want to sing it, but I won't. But again, we go back to untreated hearing loss can really impact your entire body system. There's connections to cardiovascular disease, to renal issues. It's a huge impact for falls and balance, and in particular for our aging population. So anytime where we don't have that balance in our ears, we have a risk factor for a lot of different things for adults in particular. So we're looking at how can we treat the hearing loss to the best of our ability. And again, I think there's a misconception with hearing devices that as soon as you put them on, you're going to hear magically, and we get to hear the birds sing again, and it takes time. And we kind of equate it to a broken bone that will never reset 100%, but it still takes months for our body to heal. And so we're looking at the same thing when we're talking about hearing aids, because it takes your brain months to retrain and regain that ability to understand what I'm hearing. And so it's really a brain reaction.
Yeah, and for vision, it's been a while since I've looked into the brain anatomy stuff, but my memory of it is that the part of the brain that processes visual stimuli is a pretty big part of our brains. And so this is just sort of a pet theory of mine. It has no scientific backing whatsoever.
We like those the best.
But it's sort of my thinking that if our brain is not utilizing that portion for the purpose it was set aside for, like, isn't there space there for us to be doing something else? So I think brain anatomy and physiology is just endlessly fascinating, right? Because we don't really understand our brains well. As amazing and magical as science seems these days, it's still a part of us that is pretty poorly understood, I think. So, I think there is a vast potential for that untapped space to be utilized in one way or another. people seem to think you develop magic powers when your sight becomes poor, that somehow you can hear things that other people don't hear, or your sense of touch is somehow incredibly heightened. And none of these things are about developing superpowers. They're just about, where is our attention? You know, what are we using in the world around us to tell us about the world around us? So yeah, sound means more to me than it probably does the average person who sees quote unquote normally, right? And touch, for sure. I use a lot of cues from the physical world to sort of orient myself and do that kind of thing. But yeah, I think, you know, the negative way these things can turn is that lack of sight turns into, there's a space there that people fill with anger and resentment and frustration, and that's a lot of what I end up talking with clients about, is how to not go there, not land there. But the positive side is, I think that space is also there to fill with, you know, the empathy that I talked about earlier. And yeah, I think the message that I'm always sharing with clients who may be new to sight loss is life doesn't end with this new development in your world, and there's plenty of really great, positive, life affirming stuff to come if that's what you're after. But you know, it's a difficult journey, and like Renee was talking about, if you've got this situation, each and every one of us has to advocate for ourselves. There's a kind of work we have to do that the average able-bodied person doesn't have to do. You got to have a spiel, because you're going to use that spiel over and over and over again, and that gets aggravating at times, but it's what grants us access to the world outside of our four walls we live in, you know. So yeah, obviously this is a topic that I don't get a chance to talk about, but I really do enjoy just exposing people to more of this, because again, it's a topic that doesn't come up in everyday conversation for most people, and it's one that we need to be having.
Well, it's so important. One of Project Ricochet's strongest partners is the Bluegrass Council for the Blind. Mm-hmm. And so we do a lot of work there. We volunteer there quite often. And it's because my Uncle Bill, so my husband's uncle, he lost his sight. He's had a number of different operations and challenges and things of that nature. And so the family has galvanized around him, and we do everything that we possibly can to make sure that he doesn't experience a lot of the challenges that other people do without that kind of support. But certainly organizations such as the Council for the Blind, the Kentucky Council for the Blind, the Bluegrass Council for the Blind, the organization that you serve. And just one last final question, if you don't mind, Marcey, and that is, as executive director, what can we do as a community to support you in the work and in the leadership that you have committed to in this work?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I always say that I wear my mom hat first, because I'm a proud mama of a kiddo who's been through every service with us. And as long as he lives in Kentucky, he has to come to the Hearing and Speech Center for Audiology. But I would not be a good executive director if I didn't say we need funding. And so funding is critical. And being an ambassador, if someone, when they hear this story and go, oh my gosh, I have a neighbor who I think would benefit from a test or diagnostics, then they know that they can go somewhere that is a nonprofit and that we can support their entire journey, because it is different to be in our environment. We give the gift of time to our clinicians, not that others aren't wonderful in town, but because we do have that nonprofit status, we get to have a lot more time with our clients and our patients. So just either referrals to us and funding if it's in their heart.
And Jeremy, what can the community be doing to support people like you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's an easy answer. Just help where you can. You know, if there's somebody in your congregation at church who's visually impaired, I mean, if you spend 2 hours on a Saturday once a month with somebody, helping them look through their mail or taking care of something outside on their house that maybe they don't know is going on. I mean, these are not, it's the amount that supports somebody is just incalculable. It seems like such a small thing, but just a little bit of your time to support somebody to do things, take a friend to a doctor's appointment or something like that. That stuff, it just eases the journey so much. And it's something I learned in college, that when we've got a chance to support other people, even those of us who need support from others, like that, it is so rewarding to do that and feel just the value and the shared humanity. And that's a better world, right? When we're all sort of thinking about those things and doing that stuff.
I like to call that's the Ricochet effect.
That is the Ricochet effect. And I would like to say, too, that, also it's helpful to be able to ask for help when you need it as well. And Dr. Elamine and I have talked about, being up in front of an audience. And sometimes that audience is, a few people, but sometimes it's a few hundred. But I noticed with myself being only able to hear on my left side that I turn my body for the majority of that course that I'm teaching to the left side. And I've had to really retrain myself to recognize that there's people on the right side of the room. So one of the things that I do is I just really disclose this up front. And I ask the people on the left side of the room to help me, because if my body's turned and someone's trying to ask a question on the right side of the room, I'm not going to see that. So it's a team effort, right? And do not be afraid to ask for help or to feel embarrassed about, what has happened in your life or that's afflicting your ability to do your job now. Because everybody, my experience has been that it's almost like once you disclose that, everybody's very accommodating and very helpful. But when you try to mask it, sometimes that's when it gets a little difficult.
Yeah, yeah. It really puts you in a corner, too.
It does.
Right? It's isolating to live with that, just, not sharing it.
Yes. So we have come to the end of another great episode of The Ricochet Effect, hosted by Renee Collins-Cobb and Dr. Elamine. And Marcey, I wanted to thank you so much for being with us here today. And Jeremy, you as well. We should continue this conversation.
Absolutely.
But we're so happy that you've been able to contribute your, education and your experiences and your advice, right, to organizations, to teams, and even individuals on how we can all provide more accessibility to people with disabilities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, we've come to the close of another amazing podcast. I'd like to thank our listeners. I'd like to thank our guest. And as we say here at WUKY, we can't do it without our community. And just keep in mind that DEIB is the DNA of humanity. The vision of Project Ricochet is to find practical solutions that assist minority youth who are prone to antisocial behaviors while discovering positive and productive lifestyle alternatives. An overarching goal of Project Ricochet is to work and communicate in genuine ways with existing organizations and groups which have a similar focus as we do. Our programming is distinctive because it provides development opportunities for community and economic empowerment.
It's the Ricochet effect, Ricochet effect. It's the Ricochet effect, Ricochet effect, Ricochet effect, Ricochet effect.